sitozivawo mwari asika ndipo pawanda.
If you were going to write your autobiography, the story of your life thus far, where would you start? How much would you leave in? How much would you leave out? And what difference would it make? Well, where would you start? What's your earliest memory? There's method to my madness, really.
3 years old.
3 years old. That's your earliest memory? 3 years old? Okay. All right. And how old are you now? 19. Okay. So you got about 16 years of narrative there, right? So what would you leave in and what would you leave out? Okay. All right. And I could say, and this is not a put down, right? Because you actually have to live beyond the age that you are to have this perspective. You know, like with my kids, so my kids are like 27 and 25. So I said, okay, you don't even have an idea about what life is about when you're that age. Like, you know, my point of view is you're not even an adult till you have kids, really, because then you can't even conceive of having a future. That is to say, right, if you're going to have a kid with somebody, and I'm basically saying that because to my kids from having had kids, make sure that whoever you know, assuming you're heterosexual, whoever you have sex with is somebody that you're willing to have kids with. And that has a vision of their life for at least 20 years in the future. But if you're not 20 years old, well, even if you are 20 years old, that's difficult for you to even think 20 years in the future because that's all you've been alive. But if you're 40, you can actually conceive of 20 years. Like, okay, I'm 57 and I've been at Lane Community College for 20 years, which I never thought I'd even make it past the first 5. Because stuff was, you know, it's like you go through things like, you know, I don't know what your tolerance is for BS on the job, but, you know, if you play games, 3 strikes are out. Is it 4 fouls in college ball or 5 fouls in professional ball? What happens when you have 28 fouls that any one of them you would have quit in the first 3 years? Either against you or somebody else. And that's just in the first 3 years. But then I realized, okay, I'm not going to get run off from this. I'm staying. Is that the best you can do? Is that all you got? Really? You trying that one? Hicktown. So, writing that down as a story, right? Remember, the hero is the teller of the tale, so you're going to leave some things in, you're going to leave some things out. And what would your kids, if any, say about you? Or the people that knew you in life, what would they say about you? And then, if you write all that stuff down, what will other people think about you? And how does the narrative, that is, change? And what are the implications of the narrative changing? Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, okay, is like we're allegedly the United States, there's a narrative about, you know, being a Christian nation. So what does that mean precisely? And which narrative of Christianity are we working off of? So what I've thrown at you is, okay, investigate this. I don't give you anything that I don't have a reference for. And you can ask me what the reference is. And I'll say, look, Chilton is writing this. He's a Jesuit, which means he's part of the Catholic Church. There's part of the Catholic narrative I distrust, but what I do trust is that they will at least use sources, even if the sources prove their story. Right? I can at least understand that that's what they're going to do. They're going to be academics, because that's the academic tradition that built the Western canon. Okay? If it's written down, we believe it. If it's not, it's going to be subject to interpretation. And what are the implications if we do that? What changes? So like I said, doesn't really matter if you believe that Yeshua was black. Doesn't. But you need to understand, for the people that I revere, that are giants in African American culture, they did. That's all you need to get. They did, and that's what guided their efforts. So that meant that they came from a particular framework. So if I tell you, as I may have, and let me know because I misremember stuff, all right? The Aramaic-speaking church, they exist today. They didn't participate in the Crusades. They didn't burn 9 million European women as witches. They didn't burn homosexuals at the stake. They didn't do any wars. They've never done any war at all to this day. They didn't believe in colonization to this day. And they still exist. So the whole narrative about Christianity is what you've heard from the Romans, who I say, kill Jesus. So, right, Jesus didn't have an army. Jesus didn't kill anybody. Where do you get the idea of Christian soldiers? A just war, a holy war, So it's like, yeah, you may think the Muslims have a violent religion, but ask a Native American about the Christians. Look at the millions of Africans enslaved by Christians. They may have been sold into slavery by Muslims. Jewish people might have had a hand in that too. But again, nobody's blameless. Like my grandma used to say, pot can't call the kettle black. That's dating back to the time when stoves were wood-fired, so everything was black, in case you don't relate to that. What is he talking about? Pot can't call the kettle black. My pots are stainless steel. Well, I mean, it's a perspective, right? It's like, I'm old enough to remember, and I lived in rural areas where we had to cook on wood stoves, and yeah. There's a question. I saw somebody raise a hand. Yeah, go ahead.
For some reason I was under the impression Aramaic was like a dead language, so is it not a dead language by any means?
There are people that are speaking it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a live language, but again, there's ancient Aramaic, or Syriac as it's called too, and there's current. So it's changed, right? So in order to be a scholar in it, you would basically have to know all the forms that have changed. Like, you can see this with English, all right? Study, Chaucer. That's a different style of English than even Shakespeare, and they're only a couple of 100 years apart. So remember when you're reading Canterbury Tales, if you've ever read Canterbury Tales, so just check it out. Read Canterbury Tales, then read Shakespearean English, which is basically, KJV, King James Version of the Bible, with these and those and thou mayest and all that, and to now, which is like the new, I forget what the version is, but basically the American Standard Version of the Bible, which is like contemporary English. And you compare those, and they're way different, right? So languages change over time. The reason we use Latin is nobody's speaking that. It's a dead language, technically, okay? But Syriac, there are still native speakers of that today, still. Yeah. So the reason I'm going off on this is like, okay, the narrative makes a difference, and how you change it, what you leave in, what you leave out, changes. So not only your personal story, but also in terms of history. And it doesn't matter necessarily what your adversary believes. You don't have to believe what your adversary believes. You just have to understand that they believe it. All right? So when Muslims get exercised about desecrating the Quran, the reason they do that is just like the Jews who consider their Torah a person, alive, like a person. And if it becomes damaged, you need to give it a proper burial, just like a person who's dead needs a proper burial. Okay, you don't have to believe that about your Bible. That's cool. Oh, Bible, it's just like the phone book. Throw it away. You don't really believe that if you're a Christian, right? You don't. But you don't, go to the point of, we're going to go to war because you desecrated, because you peed on a Bible or whatever. But, it's definitely an insult, right? But that's how people feel about, saying Muhammad was this, that, and the other, and they go off. Well, again, you don't have to believe that same way about your particular faith, if any, but you just need to understand why they feel that. It may look irrational to you, but there's a whole history about why that is. So as an example then, where we left off, the Roman coin, Yeshua, that's a problem with, let's see, did we get this back? Nope. Okay. So what you can't see, the words of Yeshua, Yehoshua, Yeshua, Iazus, Jesus, Isho. We call him for short for Yeshua. The Greeks who named him, knew of him, later referred to him as Iazus, or literally healing Zeus. And when the Latin alphabet turned the I from the Greek into J, he was then known as Jesus. That's where you got Jesus from. Iazus. So literally, if I draw it out on the board, Yeshua, the Supreme Being, Yeshua, saves and restores. Or Yeshua, it could be I or Y. Yeshua, or Yehoshua, different pronunciations. Or Isho for short. The Greeks called him Zeus. Zeus was their top god, healing Zeus. I becomes J, G, Zeus. So the narrative changes when the name changes slightly. What are the implications of that? Possibly. Does the story change? So Roman coin 300 AD shows their conception of what Christ looked like. So as we were talking about, as with representations of Buddha, tight curls is a representation of one of many African hairstyles. And this is before racism as we know it was created. So, when the Romans killed Isho, it's because he threatened the established religious order. So, at the time, there could have been, and actually were, according to scholars, about 200 different forms of Judaism alone. So, goddess worshippers, Yahwists, Essenes, Sadducees, Pharisees, 200 different sects. So early Christians were persecuted by the Romans, and many of them sought sanctuary among the Romans' enemies, the Persians. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Persians allowed the Christians to practice their religion, and being both an oral and literate people, eventually the words were written down in Aramaic. This is where the Peshitta comes from. So back to 450 AD and contains Old and New Testament. There are actually a copy of them. So there are also a number of Gospels, up to like 200 different books. King James's editing team edited out, as well as changing words like tyrant to kings, and physical descriptions, virile and manly to white and ruddy. So for example, the Song of Solomon, Makeda, who was an African queen. And Solomon. Basically, she's describing, the Song of Solomon is a love poetry between them both. They're both geniuses in their own right and rulers of country in their own right who fall in love, and the Song of Solomon is basically love poetry between them. So the translation team in King James basically says, all right, where the Bible clearly in the original says tyrant, well, we'll change tyrant to kings. Well, that's different. That's a spin. And, when the description says, Makeda is describing her man as virile and manly, and then they change it to white and ruddy, like, no, that ain't the same. So why would they do that? Well, that's the narrative that says, okay, we're creating, like my grandfather would say, okay, so if Jesus was black, and how can we have a white Jesus in our church in Oakland in 1965? The explanation that white folks would burn the church down because we have a black Jesus, okay, that goes a little towards explaining it, but then he goes on to say, people like to worship a God, where they like to worship a God that looks like them. Okay, that makes more sense. All right, fine. So why don't we have the historical accurate version then of the image? What happens when we change that? How does that narrative get left out? So Isho spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew, not Greek, certainly not Latin. It's possible he could speak Hebrew, because Hebrew is essentially a temple language. It is only spoken in religious ceremony inside the temple. It's not used on the street. Just like in Christianity or Islam. Okay, you're going to pray in Islam, you do it in Arabic, but Arabs are a minority of Muslims on the planet. Okay, so Arabic is a sacred, in Islam they pray in Arabic, but Muslims don't have to be Arabs. Christianity has multiple languages, but the scripture starts from what? This narrative that the Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English or whatever the language is, right? So one possible reason we never hear about the Peshitta or even Aramaic is because we've been exposed to the Paulist, Romanized version of Christianity. So Paul, if you remember from Chilton's narrative, he was in jail during the ministry. He was a murderer. And he got converted on, as we told in the narrative, on the road to Damascus. Why are you persecuting me? Start my church. It is said that God said to Paul, okay, how do I do that? Where am I going? Oh, I'm going with the Romans. Okay, why the Romans? Well, you go, the way to love your enemy is to convert them to your point of view. That's why we're going, and the Romans killed Jesus. We're going to the Romans. Now, that's my interpretation. Like, why would you go to the enemy to convert them? That seems like suicide to me. But that ain't me. But the Romans, the Paulist, the Romanized version of Christianity is what we came with. So Paul never knew Jesus personally. So he converts later, and this is my particular bias, but there are some things outside the Da Vinci Code which I believe is fiction, but it is reflecting a reality. Those of you who talk about or who are familiar with popular culture, you've seen The Matrix? The actual real life historical Merovingians are people who believe that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had kids, and they're worshiping a descendant of that kid. Mary Magdalene actually died at 92 years old. In Europe, I believe it was, according to the Catholic Church. Now, in most narratives of Western Christianity, Jesus was celibate? No, actually, we don't even know about Jesus' sex life. Now, we do know that the Jews of the time are not celibate. You can't be a rabbi unless because as a rabbi, you're going to marry people, you're going to counsel people, et cetera, that are married. In order to be able to do that credibly, you have to be married as well. And within the marriage, so for example, the tradition of marriage around the time is the groom that supplies the wine. So there's one narrative that says, okay, Yeshua converting water to wine, well, that's at his and Mary's wedding to do that. Okay. So, the reason to believe that Mary Magdalene would have been Yeshua's spiritual successor, I didn't use the Da Vinci Code for that. I used reading the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and what it contains. So, Peshitta itself means original, straight, simple, sincere, and true. The definitive text for the Near East, India, Church of the East, the Roman Catholic Church of the East, in use for 400 years before the Christian Church divided into several sects, one of them being Protestantism. So everything else outside of Catholicism, outside of the Western Church. The Protestant, what they were protesting was the power of the church to control everything. People rebelled. So let's see, did that skip? Yeah, okay. So, such being the case, the role of the sacred feminine in Yeshua's religious teachings. Like, again, how many people did Yeshua kill? The role of the sacred feminine. If I'm going from the point of view that Christianity is an African religion, and in African religion, there is always a sacred feminine. You look for it there, right? And that kind of drives the political practices. So, for example, since Jesus didn't have an army, Jesus didn't kill anybody, how do you get Christian soldiers? So we don't know about the sacred feminine, except that we hear about the story from the Romans, not the Persians. And I basically have explained how Aramaic Christians today still exist. And so we basically come to believe that the Roman story is the only story, by having the rest of the story left out. So just like Columbus discovered America, and you know how I feel about that, and that there's another reality. So you can find Yeshua's views about the sacred feminine in the Aramaic tradition, as well as some of the Gnostic Gospels, particularly those attributed to Miriam of Magdala, who anglicized that into Mary Magdalene. So take, for example, this is an example of Mary. This is an icon from the Eastern Church. It's a representation of Miriam of Magdala. That's actually her name in Aramaic. She's holding an egg. So it's my opinion that she's a companion. Companion literally means to break bread with, but also it's who you've hooked up with. It's your boo, as it were. All right? And I believe her to be his actual spiritual successor, but the boys decided to take it in a different direction. So in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is part of the Gnostic Gospels, so-called Gnostic Gospels, These are basically writings around Christianity that were not included in, or either edited out, existed in parallel, or exist at the same time as what became the King James Version of the Bible. So I'm not sure why we don't have a Bible that includes all of this stuff. So at the moment, they're called the Gnostic Gospels, and so Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Thomas, etc. Sayings of various people. Question?
So wasn't there like some sort of like council on the initial?
Yes, the Council in Nicaea. We'll get into that in a little bit. Yeah. So in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Isho says, "You suffer because you love what deceives you." The way out of suffering is to understand why and how you are suffering and loose the chains that bind you. For example, as it said in the Aramaic Lord's Prayer, as we showed the other day. So Aramaic, like its sister languages, has 3 levels of meaning: literal, relational, and metaphorical. So literal is the most obvious meaning. Relational, like wordplay, the meaning changes in relationship to other words. And metaphorical, an image arising out of the first 2 meanings to suggest yet another more universal truth. Now, when you try and explain this in English, there are words that we actually do this with in English, or word concepts that we adopt from other languages that become standard in English. So, for example, déjà vu in French, which means already have seen. So there isn't a concept for that in English, right? But it does exist in French. So, but you don't have a word for something unless it becomes a common experience, right? You have to have the experience first. Thought precedes language, and then language becomes the written word or speech. So you have to have the experience first to have a word for it. And then the word can spread if other people have that same experience that, well, I saw you in a dream last week and here you are. Wait, how can you see me in a dream last week? How does that work? What is the nature of time? So, metaphorical, relational, literal. So, what follows is the literal meaning of each line of the Lord's Prayer. So, when Isho says pray in his name, as we talked about the other day, name is not simply the identity of a particular person, but like a musical note to be in harmony with, to be in rhythm with. Because remember, Shala Shem, Shala, pray in my name. Shala means to open up a space where you're in awe and you're quiet. Shem. So open up a space, be quiet, be in awe. In my name, Shala Shem. Shem, name, rhythm, illumination, atmosphere. Okay, all of those things simultaneously. So he's a son of Israel. He's steeped in a culture. The nation of Israel, whether in bondage or free, sovereign or conquered, it arose out of an African context and was therefore influenced by other Africans. So even if we understand that Christianity arose out of Judaism and all of his teachings were already part of Judaism, we still need to understand the key concepts that are in effect today. One, I know this is a reiteration, but it's useful to reiterate this. Jews didn't and don't believe in a hell. Jews didn't and don't believe in a devil. Either. Yes?
So since they don't believe in a devil, but in standard the Bible's Judeo-Christian, the first Old Testament is adapted from Judaism, isn't it? Is that correct? Then what role is the snake? Is Christian adopted as a devil?
Yeah. Good questions. We'll see that. Keep that in mind. So, yes, the kingdom of heaven existed. Yes, there was evil in the world. but not a devil. All right? There was not a deity or a fallen archangel capable of nullifying God's will on earth. Okay? To admit that a devil exists means that God's not powerful on earth. Nope, we ain't playing that.